III to restore Jerusalem and other territories in Palestine to Christian control. The target for the crusade was Egypt, the power center of the Ayyubid Sultan, who at the time controlled Jerusalem. The Frankish, or French leaders of the crusade, contracted the Republic of Venice to build a fleet and transport the Crusader army overseas to Egypt. However, as it turned out, many Crusaders ultimately chose to travel to the Holy Land by other means, and so the Frankish leaders ended up with a far smaller army assembling in Venice than they had originally anticipated. As a result, the Franks couldn't pay Venice's bill for their fleet. In 1202, Venice's leader, the Doge Enrico Dandolo, asked the Franks to fulfill their debt by helping Venice conquer Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic Sea. In effect, Dandolo was asking the Crusaders to break their solemn vow by attacking a Christian town. The Frankish leaders agreed, resulting in many Crusaders abandoning the expedition in disgust and traveling to Palestine by other means. Ultimately, the Franks helped the Venetians take Zara in November of 1202. When the Pope heard about this, he excommunicated the Venetians and the Franks who'd taken part in the attack on Zara. This is a crucial moment in the history of the so-called Fourth Crusade, for at this point, it can no longer really be called a crusade. Once the Venetians and Franks attacked a Christian city and fell under the Pope's excommunication, their status as crusaders was null, and they were no longer engaged in a church-sanctioned crusade. It's therefore a bit misleading that the Fourth Crusade is even called the Fourth Crusade. Ultimately, the Franks who remained with the Doge and his Venetian fleet ended up attacking and conquering another Christian city, Constantinople. At this point, they set up a new Latin government, the Latin Empire of Constantinople. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire fragmented into 3 successor states centered in Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus. The Latin government of the Venetians and Franks would endure for several decades until the Byzantines recaptured Constantinople and re-established the Byzantine Empire in 1261. The Frankish-Venetian conquest of Constantinople in 1204 was one of the few times that this supremely well-defended city was taken by assault. But did 1204 really destroy the Byzantine Empire? What was the state of Byzantium before the Fourth Crusade? What other factors were at play? Potentially, it wasn't the Fourth Crusade that destroyed the Byzantine Empire. It was internal developments within Byzantium itself, going back several decades and arguably centuries. Crucially, the 1180s and the 1190s were a time when the Byzantine Empire was, in many ways, imploding. The culprits? A series of absolutely incompetent and even malicious rulers who rendered the ancient Byzantine Empire a mere husk of its former self. One must ask the question, why was it even possible for the Fourth Crusade to capture Constantinople? Throughout history, Constantinople had been impregnable. What was different in 1204? The answer lies further back in time. In 1180, Manuel Comnenus, ruler of the Byzantine Empire, died. Manuel had been a highly capable emperor. As it turned out, his death would spell disaster for Byzantium. Manuel left behind a child heir, Alexius II. In 1182, one of the late emperor's cousins, Andronicus Comnenus, assumed guardianship of young Alexius II. Andronicus was an unscrupulous scoundrel who in the past had tried to assassinate Manuel and had twice deserted to the Turks. Now, Andronicus launched a palace coup. He strangled to death the boy he was meant to guard and seized the throne for himself. Andronicus at once announced a fiercely anti-Western policy. Westerners, that is, Latin Christians, Catholic Christians from Western and Central Europe, were to receive no protection from the new emperor. As a result, the notorious massacre of the Latins took place in Constantinople in 1182, in which mobs slaughtered thousands of Latin Christian, mostly Italian, men, women, and children. Those Latin Christians who survived were sold as slaves to the Seljuk Turks of Rome. But Andronicus's power was short-lived. Rebellions rose across the empire to avenge the murdered Alexius II. In response, Andronicus launched a reign of terror. Suspecting everyone of plotting coups, he had countless tortured and murdered. Finally, a young nobleman called Isaac Angelus launched a successful revolt, which resulted in a crowd seizing and dismembering Andronicus. Isaac now took the throne, but the worst was yet to come. It was through this bloody affair that the Byzantine Empire passed into the hands of a family called Angeloi. 19th century British historian Charles Oman once wrote that in the history of the Byzantine Empire, that period covered by the reign of the two wretched Angeloi may be pronounced the most shameful. The particular evil of these two emperors, Isaac Angelus and Alexius Angelus, was that they treated the Byzantine state as a personal pleasure garden. They squandered the empire's resources on banquets and luxury while gutting the army and infrastructure. The roots of the problem were already in place. The Byzantine army had never recovered from the 11th century invasions of the Seljuk Turks, which deprived the empire of its traditional recruiting grounds in Asia Minor. From then on, the Byzantines were... All right, everybody, welcome to the stream today. Let's add Helena here. Hi, Helena. How are you doing? All right.
Can you hear me now?
Let me make sure I can hear you here.
Can you hear me? I'm gonna take the video off. I'll take the video off to reduce bandwidth. Okay, I don't look pretty with the microphone.
Well, I saw all your great looking books back there. That was pretty cool to get to see that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can hear you very well, and it looks like everybody in the chat can hear you. I was actually thinking maybe you weren't going to make it, and so I went ahead and just kind of let.
Sorry, I've now interrupted the documentary here.
Oh, well, I always do that. I put on a little pre-roll just to kind of, start things off, and then, about 10 minutes or so later, just kind of jump on. And
okay.
But I was going to do that before we had a chance to talk, or I was going to do that after we kind of did a little test, but that's okay. Everything seems to be sounding good. So, yeah, I think we got a good little setup here. In case anybody doesn't know, Helena Schroeder is joining us today for Coffee and the Crusades, and she's coming all the way from
Greece,
the territory. It's fitting that little documentary we had going because you're coming from the territory of the Latin Empire.
That's true,
right?
The Byzantine Empire.
Well, yeah, but then it became the Latin Empire after.
True, very true. This was Venetian.
Yeah, okay. I guess that's true. The island you're on was held by Venice?
Venetians, by Venice, and was never lost to the Ottomans. It remained in Venetian hands until Napoleon destroyed the Venetian state republic.
Wow. So there were some there were some
exactly
aspects
two islands.
Of the Fourth Crusade. Some of the conquests of the Fourth Crusade lasted until Napoleon. Wow. That's pretty interesting.
Two islands.
Two islands. Okay. Yeah, I just read this massive book about Latin Greece, written in 1907, so it's a bit out of date.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't remember the author's name, but it's pretty interesting.
What's the title? Did it say anything about the women's parliament? Something.
There is a lot of stuff about the women in the empire. Yeah, there was a thing where so many of the men were POWs that they had to. It was just the ladies who got together.
Exactly.
Yeah, history of Latin Greece. I was thinking about that. It's really interesting how. Let's see, what was the name of? Well, I'll look it up later, but it's very old. William Miller was the guy's name. The Latins in the Levant: History of Frankish Greece. Very, very old, but it's interesting to read stuff from that period.
Yes.
Oh yeah, I was kind of thinking
it's available on Amazon.
Yeah,
wow, it is available.
It costs like $3 or $4 on Amazon. It's from one of
this
those.
Is tremendous.
Companies. Yeah, one of those companies that kind of reprints, really old stuff.
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, everybody. Here, Helena, try putting your camera. Do you mind putting your camera on? I mean, does everybody want Helena to put her camera on? There we go. So we can kind of have a back and forth a little bit here.
Okay.
Look at all those books.
We're risking our bandwidth, because if things go off.
Well, everybody in the chat, just let us know if there are any problems with that. If we have bandwidth issues, and we will turn off Helena's camera dutifully. Everybody's saying it sounds good. So that's good. Okay, so hope everybody's doing good today. Welcome to our little hangout that we do on Tuesdays and Fridays. So let's jump to some questions. We already had some up here, but you guys, if you want to come up with some question ideas, go ahead and do that. Looks like we got Nalu here. Nalu is in Spain, and Chris in Texas. I know where all these people are. John, Sam in Ohio. We got Alexander from Sweden. We got a lot of the whole crew here, so that's good. So, and just an FYI to everybody, Helena does have a new book out called Kingdoms at the Crossroads of Civilizations, which is a history of the Crusader states. So that has been a really, really exciting release that you did, Helena, and I'm glad that you did it. How are things going with that book? I know you've been kind of going around talking about it.
The most exciting thing is that Adrian Boas, who of course was the founder of Crusades, the Department of Crusades Archaeology at the Hebrew University at Jerusalem, endorsed the book. He said that it's an excellent book. I don't have it right now in my hand, but basically he said in his review that it's extremely well researched, and that although I bill it as something for laymen, he said it was something that was worth being read even by scholars. Or at least students, let's put it that way. Obviously, if people who are already in their PhD working on Crusades topics know everything that's in the book, it doesn't really uncover any new material. But it's an excellent starting point, he points out, and I think so too, for people who aren't already deep in the weeds of Crusader research and scholarship.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed it. The thing I like about your writing is it is fairly punchy, and it does kind of get more toward the interesting narrative aspects of things, while also picking up on a lot of the interesting points, things that are debated, things that, maybe everybody has wondered about over the years, like, well, what were the problems with the Second Crusade, or why did they lose the Battle of Hattin, or, what happened after Saladin died. I mean, just like these little things that kind of maybe have some back and forth in the historical community and in the online world too, that people debate. You kind of weigh in on a lot of that stuff, and that is to me, that's interesting. I like it when an author can do that.
Well, at the same time, as I said, what I really wanted to do was focus on the Crusades. I ended up, though, putting in that chronology at the beginning, because you can't just plunge in and talk about things if people don't know, well, wait a minute, where's the county of Tripoli, and how did Cyprus become a Crusader state? And so I realized I couldn't just start with a descriptive of the Crusader states. I really had to start with a chronological narrative. And that's why I end up spending practically half, so I think it's about 40% of the book, with a very concise chronology of the Crusades. And that is always dangerous, because of course there's much longer books, and there's lots, hundreds of books, if not thousands of books about the Crusades. So it's pretty pared down, and that's probably, I think it's where I think it's the weakest part of the book, because I couldn't go into real depth and still have space for what I actually set out to do, which was to provide a descriptive of what life was in the Crusader states. And yet, as I said, the point of this book was to pull together all sorts of material that's out there already, but is fragmented normally in academic studies that are very narrowly focused, like a study of medicine during the Crusades. That doesn't get covered in most histories of the Crusades, but it's incredibly important because the Crusader states was actually was a melting point and a place of technological exchange, particularly in respect to medical technology. And also things like art history, and I say economic history, social history, and not just military history. The focus on the Crusades puts a particularly strong emphasis on military history. And I get it. People are more interested in military history than diplomatic history and social history and economic history, which is why there's more books about the Crusades, about the Crusader states. But this attempts to redress that balance a little bit.
Yeah, that's one of the good things about the book is that it really gets to daily life in the Crusader states. I mean,
Right.
And the fact is, this wasn't just a constant battleground. A lot of normal life went on, and the Crusaders really improved the regions they ruled in, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah. As I say, there's some people who would argue that Crusader states actually were at peace more than the states in Western Europe at this time. That's obviously true of Iberia. But even France and England were at war with each other so much during these 200 years that there's a case to be made for the fact that the people living in the Levant actually had a more peaceful existence, only interrupted only sporadically by these outbursts of conflict. Certainly, and I think that's really important, is that the lifestyle or the quality of life in the Levant was higher than it was in most of the rest of the world, simply because of climate and the fact that it was an entrepot for trade, which means things were coming in from Arabia, from India, from China even. They Chinese porcelain passing through the Levant in this period, so that the quality of life or the lifestyle in the Levant was more advanced. Also, functioning sewage systems, citywide sewage systems, aqueducts coming into the cities. It was a very high level standard of living that these people enjoyed in the Levant compared to people in the fringes of Western Europe and other parts of the world.
Yeah, that really comes through in the book. And Helena, actually, go ahead and turn your camera off because you were kind of roboting there in the last one.
Okay,
so
I thought it might. Stops cam. Okay. Try with just the sound.
Okay, so let's go ahead and jump to some questions. Actually, at the very beginning, I'm gonna let you tackle any of these first that you want, Helena. So we have from Malalo Mwan Law Lian. What was the agreement between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin?
Well, there was a truce at the end of the Third Crusade, which was only for 3 years, I think 3 months and 10 days or something. I have to go back and look at it exactly. But there was a truce which basically left, which basically said they would put down their arms and stop fighting. And with the territories then held by each side being held by each side, which he managed to secure during his short crusade, was left in the hands of the Crusaders, but nothing more. And the Crusaders agreed not to attack, which was not a hard thing to promise since they didn't have a lot of resources to attack Saladin at that point. But basically, Saladin agreed not to try to attack for the period of that truce. It was only a truce.
Right, exactly. Basically, Saladin acknowledged a fair amount of the Crusaders' conquests, which kind of interesting to me. I mean, the Third Crusade was more of an accomplishment than it was a failure, and a lot of that had to do with, so it's kind of funny when people call it a draw, or like they fought to a draw. Well, not really. I mean, they didn't take Jerusalem, but I mean, the Crusaders took stuff from Saladin that
they reestablished the viability of the kingdom. They reestablished the viability of the kingdom of Jerusalem. Without the Third Crusade, all they had was Tyre, which is not a kingdom, and the Third Crusade, by reestablishing control of the coastal piece, from Jaffa at that point up to Accra, and by, of course, most important of all, seizing Cyprus. It's always forgotten. Cyprus is forgotten over and over again. Cyprus was the basis with which the second 100 years of the Crusader states lived. It was their breadbasket. It was the staging ground for crusades. It defended the Eastern Mediterranean from the pirates and controlled by Muslim fleets.
And Alexander says, have you heard of Birger Jarl's crusade in Finland? I have not heard of that. Sounds interesting.
I know nothing about the Northern Crusades.
And Lambert says, what is the modern legacy of the Lusignan dynasty in Cyprus? That's kind of an interesting question.
I don't know about legacy because, of course, the Ottomans wiped pretty much everything out, but it is remembered in Cyprus to this day by Cypriot scholars as the Lusignan dynasty is popular in modern Cypriot historiography. It is recognized as having been a period in which the island was one of the few eras, if not the only era practically, when it was independent, when its rulers were native. Now, you can say, well, the Lusignans weren't native. Well, by the second, third generation, they were considered natives. They've been born there. And they were not ruling for the sake of a distant metropole. They were, when under the Byzantines, Constantinople was taking all the money. The landlords were often absentee. Under the Arabs, the leaders lived. The money was being shipped out of the island to support whoever the respective power was. Under the Lusignans, the kings were resident on Cyprus, and the revenue stayed on Cyprus, and that benefited the entire population, and that's recognized today. I'm going to jump in and say, even by church scholars are increasingly saying the Latin Church didn't interfere that much, and it was not a period of oppression for the Church, for the Orthodox Church.
And John says, I have a question. Did King Baldwin IV do all in his power to keep peaceful relations with the outlying kingdoms? And what trades and relations were established?
No, Baldwin IV was a very militant king. Within 2 weeks of becoming king, he was attacking Saladin, the Sultanate of Damascus, by going into by taking cavalry into Saladin's kingdom in an offensive campaign. Baldwin IV was a very militant king. He also allied with the Byzantines to attack Egypt. He was then cut down. The problem was he had repeated cases he had repeated health problems, and it was not just leprosy. He was repeatedly had fevers. I suspect, without any more than my very layman's knowledge, that he was suffering from malaria as well as leprosy, because he would be suddenly struck down by a fever and incapacitated for weeks and almost on his deathbed. And then he would recover from that, and he'd get up, he'd ride, and he'd lead his army somewhere, and then he'd be knocked down again by a fever. And at the same time, he was progressively deteriorating from leprosy.
Yeah, and I assume, I wonder, John, were you talking about specifically his relation? I mean, his main neighbor was the Sultanate of the Ayyubids, which he did not want to remain at peace with because he understood that they were an existential enemy. But the Crusader states did make some arrangements with like some of the Zengid states that were beneficial to both
our
parties.
enemy. They made a treaty. Obviously, Baldwin IV had treaties with Mosul to try to control. He had aligned himself with the heirs of Nur ad-Din against Saladin, who was a usurper, and it occurred.
And Sheila,
but only because your enemy's enemy is my friend.
Right. And Sheila says, I'm learning so much from RCH and I'm able to debate a little bit with others who are deep in the conspiracy ilk.
Dear.
I would be curious to know what conspiracies you're hearing, because I get all the time messages from people telling me that my videos about the Templars are all wrong, that they still exist and that they are running the world. Which, and I say, I don't know about that. But I guess
rather sad. That's what it is. It's terribly sad.
It shows like the immense impact psychologically that little military order from so long ago has had on the world for I guess it's kind of it's somewhat circumstantial reasons because the Latin West eventually evolved into kind of this world dominating power that then their history became somewhat of the world's history, I guess. But okay, here's a good question from Chris. He says, "Do you think Amalric made a smart choice to invade Egypt?" You actually talk a lot about this in your book, Helena.
I mean, the invasions of Egypt are an interesting sort of epoch or epoch, I should say, in the history of the Crusader states, because they're indicative of the Crusader state evolving from simply defending the Holy Land into a completely normal geopolitical power interested in expanding their wealth, even though Egypt had nothing to do with the Holy Land. There was no religious for those invasions, and it was. And then you have to say there were 4 of them, right? 4 or 5 of them. And in the beginning, they may have made sense because they were Amalric being invited in and he was getting paid an awful lot of money. Basically, they were mercenaries on the side of one of the 2 people fighting for control of Egypt. By the end, when he was invaded in violation of his own treaties, and he ultimately helps Saladin come to power. Clearly, that was not in the best interest of his kingdom. On the whole, I would say geopolitically and wisdom of hindsight that it was a great overextension, that the Kingdom of Jerusalem should not have been trying to expand geopolitically into majority Muslim states, and that even if they'd been successful, out very bad. So no, it was not a smart choice in my opinion.
Yeah, I think in hindsight, it might have made more sense to dedicate themselves to protecting the Fatimid Caliphate and just kind of acting as, that would have been the more savvy thing to do. I mean, maybe that's kind of
keep the Arabs divided, keep the Muslims divided. That, as they did in the 13th century, they were very savvy about playing the Ayyubids against each other, and they had actually done that quite effectively during the First Crusade. They were making treaties, with one side and the various Fatimid princes against each other. So, yeah, I think actually it was a bit of hubris on the part of Amalric's point. He thought he was more powerful than he was, or he thought with the Byzantines together they could, eliminate and get all the riches of the Nile. So I think it was a bit of hubris, and ultimately it weakened the kingdom.
Yeah, I remember reading somewhere that the whole reason William of Tyre was commissioned to write his big history was because Amalric expected to achieve this great conquest of Egypt, and he wanted to be sure that that was covered in this chronicle. So maybe, in an interesting way, that is the big benefit for us. Looking back historically, is that if Amalric hadn't decided to do that, maybe that would have never been commissioned. And imagine, how terrible that would be if we didn't have William of Tyre. I mean, I know
I just wish we had his history of Islam. That's been lost. I keep imagining, fantasizing about somebody finding some document somewhere, like on the island of Kithra here. They have these archives which were brought back from Cyprus as the Venetians retreated before the Ottomans. They kept bringing their archives back, which means they retreated from Cyprus. Like maybe all the Templar files were brought with them, and then they went from Cyprus to Crete, and from Crete to Kithra, right? And there are all these, and maybe mysteriously somewhere in all those papers, somebody's going to find William of Tyre's History of Islam, or somewhere else.
Okay, let's jump back. This is an interesting question from John again. Why didn't King Baldwin IV have children before his leprosy got bad?
He was dying of leprosy at the age of 8. All right.
Okay.
No.
Yeah. But he, I guess at first he was fairly, like when he was 16 and he won the Battle of Montgisard, visually he probably would not have looked that sick. Isn't that right?
Not at all. Not at all. He was riding and leading his armies from the front, but he had leprosy. It would have been absolutely inconceivable that, what princess is going to give herself to a leper? All right, let's try to put this in the perspective of a princess and her father. No, It's not
Exactly.
going to happen. And the church is not going to condone it. It was absolutely unthinkable.
Yeah, I guess today, we have a lot different ideas about, how that would work. But at that, my guess is that in the 12th century, there would have been a sense that somebody who's a leper, I mean, it's just, they're not going to have children, regardless of the degree of how far along it is. Let's see
Oh.
here. And then Dee is here with us. She says it's a mistaken. Oh, she's kind of answering an earlier question.
Yeah.
So yeah, we already got that one covered. And then Lambert is saying leprosy makes you sterile, so he never could have had children. Okay. And then Dee's also, she says, yeah, his first symptoms came when he was about 9. He was crowned at 13. Apparently, you guys were talking about this a lot in the chat. This is interesting. Did bad Templars and Crusaders take Muslim concubines openly or in secret? If so, was it forbidden? And was there a penalty for doing so? That's from Lady of Hay.
Absolutely. It was completely forbidden. They had a vow of chastity, which means that you couldn't have sex with anyone, let alone Muslim concubines. It was forbidden, and the penalty was, I think, being starved to death in a dungeon. They had a number of Templar prisoners who suffered that. So yes, it may have happened occasionally, not necessarily with Muslim concubines, because they wouldn't have been able to keep them in a monastic environment. Templars lived in monasteries. They attended mass times a day. You lived in a dormitory with other men, one bed next to another.
Yeah,
There's no opportunity for having a concubine.
Yeah, I think that's one thing people forget about the Middle Ages is how closely people live together. Like, today people can get a lot more privacy. I mean, not just in daily life, but we're talking about a monastic order. I believe the Templars, they always went around in twos also. So, I mean, it wasn't like, that the TV show Nightfall, where they show the main Templar character sneaking off and having an affair with the Queen of France, which is absurd because of the monastic lifestyle, but also on top of that, just, I mean, even the way medieval buildings and spaces were arranged. I mean, there weren't a lot of rooms in a lot of these buildings. Like, it'd be like one large ground room in a castle or something like this. And I mean, people didn't have privacy the way that we do. And they didn't really even seem to expect it the way that we do.
It was considered a step forward or back, whatever. In the 12th century was when the first time when the Lord and the Lady had their own chamber, as opposed to sleeping with the household. That's when when the Templars formed.
And even then, a lot of people would have been sleeping in that bedchamber, most likely, like servants and family members might have been sleeping in other parts of the bedchamber.
Correct.
It's intriguing to think about. When you kind of think about the way that people lived in the Middle Ages and just the different expectations, it is kind of intriguing to think about how different it was, especially in terms of things like privacy and the way a space was arranged, the way a living space was arranged. There wasn't this sense of a need for all these different separated rooms. And I don't know, it's intriguing. I know I remember reading somewhere that poetry often talks about lovers meeting in an orchard. Like, an orchard was this place where you could kind of maybe have a secret rendezvous. And then another place apparently was churches. Like, a church would be a place where, you could have like a secret meeting or something like this.
I don't know how secret it was. The idea was that you could meet there without it being a provoking suspicion, because both would be entitled to go to a church to pray at any time. Obviously, orchards and, as you say, but also places for rendezvous, as expression leading you down the garden path, etc.
Interesting.
And privacy was valued. That's why it became increased. As I say, it was increasing throughout the 12th and 13th century as more and more people wanted it. And but it was rare, and in a monastic institution, it was not sought, it was not appreciated, it was not expected. The brothers slept, they ate in refectories, they prayed in the large church. It was inconceivable and impossible to have concubines, all right? To have had fornication on the sly somewhere, say hidden in a garden or whatever, you can't exclude that possibility. But as you say, they were supposed to stay together, and if it was discovered, it was severely punished. It was a violation of their fundamental vows.
Yeah, I mean, we do know. I do know there were several of the kings in Spain, like for example, Alfonso VI, who famously had a Moorish concubine. Kings were a lot more at liberty to engage in that kind of behavior than certainly a Templar was. I know one of the issues, just getting to talking about the Northern Crusades, the Teutonic Knights took over a smaller order called the Sword Brothers, and one of the reasons for that was that they had kind of fallen completely out with their vows and were no longer living according to their vows, and they were doing things like engaging in relations with women and living it up and kind of living the good life. And so that it was kind of concluded, an investigation, that there was a complete breakdown in the order, and so they were absorbed into the Teutonic Knights. But they took that kind of things seriously. Like, I think it's kind of interesting. In a lot of movies, there's kind of this idea that, oh, well, medieval people were really just sneaking around having affairs all the time. But I think we need to be careful about discounting the intensity of religious feeling that prompted people to adhere to these moral ideas.
Not to forget that there was no pill, there was no contraceptive, and a woman was in a great risk of getting pregnant. So you weren't going to be doing that if there was any, for something, not just on a whim.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do have to accept that, human nature is human nature, and I think that all this stuff did happen, to some degree. I mean, there was certainly sexual activity that fell outside the bounds of what was sanctioned by the church, which that's one of the reasons why it was those laws existed, was because it was such a human thing. But yeah, I think it's hard to imagine a Templar having the opportunity to do something like that.
No, the question was concubines. I mean, there's no question that they could.
Yeah, with concubines.
Fornication, yes. Concubines, no. Let's go to another question. Yeah.
Baldwin's right arm and hand were crippled. This is she's always giving
that's
information in the chat.
Okay, fine.
Were Muslims of the East of Christians in Western Europe fight most with each other? I'm not quite sure what you mean by that question, Alexander. You might need to clarify that for us. Let's see. Oh, and Sheila says, yes, that's exactly it. She has spoken to people who think Templars are still running the world. Yeah, that's funny. Okay, so you guys are really getting into this discussion in the chat here. John says, after the loss of the Battle of Hattin, why did the Crusader states capitulate so quickly without putting up resistance besides Jerusalem? Maybe even talk about Balian of Ibelin and the role he had. That's a pretty big topic.
Okay, but the key point here is that when they call up the feudal army, they basically denude the cities of their garrisons. So that was always the risk when they called out the field army, that you took out most of the able or fighting men from the cities, and you field them. And in the disaster like Hattin, it means that most of those men were killed or captured, and that left the cities with very, very thin, poor, insufficient garrisons. If the war at the time was a city that resists, can be, if it falls, if a city resists and then falls to force, that the population can be put to the sword or taken into slavery. If they surrender, they can go get away with their lives. With the fall of Jerusalem, after Hattin, most of the cities of the land were indefensible. They did not have sufficient numbers of human beings capable to defend them against Saladin's armies. They had the choice of either putting up resistance, as Jaffa and Beirut did, being slaughtered and taken into slavery, or of making a deal, surrendering, and getting out with their lives, as Accra and other cities did. We don't have the right to judge that decision. I don't know what I would have done. The choice, do I fight defiantly and risk slavery, rape and slavery, or do I take the goods and run with it and get myself to Constantinople or Cyprus? What happened at Jerusalem, of course, was that the citizens of Jerusalem, very significantly, the citizens and not Queen Sibylla, refused to surrender. Saladin offered them extremely generous terms. He offered to let them exist for a year in Jerusalem, waiting for relief, and only if no relief had come within a year to then surrender. And they still defied him and said no, they could not surrender the holiest city in Christendom. And they would not, and they would fight, which was very nice and defiant of them, but there was nobody to do that. There was almost nobody in the city to defend it. They say there were 50 non-combatants to every able-bodied male. So sometimes that's interpreted as 50 women and children. I think it probably included clerics, but certainly the city was flooded with refugees, and it had 2 knights in the entire city, including Balian himself. God knows who the other knight esquire who'd come with him. The collapse of the kingdom is because the field army had been slaughtered and there was not sufficient garrisons in the cities to hold cities. Cities are hard to hold. Cities have large walls. But remember, Antioch had 400 towers. This castle stood out. Montfort, Carte de Chevalier, Quérac. Those garrisons held out for a year or more because a castle is inherently a more what you could say,
more defensible.
Smaller unit, more defensible.
You get your hands around it easier.
That's
so
right.
To speak.
Fewer men can hold a castle. It takes a lot of men to defend a city. A lot of men and women.
You can be at one part of a city and not have any idea what's going on at the other part too. So there's, it
correct.
can be nerve-wracking too.
Yeah. Even then, Carte de Chevalier falls in the 13th century because the garrison's too small. Defense of any castle requires a certain number of men, and the statistics, by the way, are always given in knights, and the rule of thumb is 10 non-knights, other fighting men for every knight. So you have 10 knights, it means you've got 100 or 110 fighting men in the castle to hold it. So a castle wasn't held by 10 men. If they say 10 knights defended a castle, it was held by 100 men. And if those men have all been slaughtered or taken slavery, if there's literally only 10 men left, they cannot defend that castle, let alone a city. So that's why the Crusader states, or the cities in the Crusader states, capitulated so rapidly after the defeat at Hattin. I don't know what you want me to say about Balian. That's a topic dear to my heart, obviously, but there's a lot to be said about that. So maybe you could be more specific in what you want to know.
Okay, fair enough. ITZ, if the caliphate existed at the time of the First Third Crusade, do you think they would have been able to take Jerusalem? Well, the caliphate actually did exist.
It exists, yeah.
You had the Abbasid Caliph right there in Baghdad.
Well, there were two. There was also the Fatimid Caliphate.
Right, yeah. And
then both of them exist. Both the caliphates predate the Crusades, the First Crusade.
Yeah. The Spanish Caliphate had fallen at that point, but
I didn't know this.
The Caliphate at Cordoba, that pretty much came to an end in 1031, I believe it was. And John says, can we name some of the greatest Templar last stand battles where they really distinguished themselves? Well, the fall of Acre in 1291 is a good example of that, where they pretty much fought to the death after the Mamluks started breaking their surrender terms and assaulting the women and children in the Templar fortress at Acre. The Mamluks were coming in, and they were, they'd agreed to terms. And when the Mamluks came in, they started basically dividing up the women and children it had been agreed that they could leave with the Templars. And so the Templars said, okay, forget this. And they killed the Mamluks who were in there, shut the gates, and said, okay, bring it on. We're going to go down with this place. And they did. And I believe, the fortress came down because of the mining and the catapults from the Mamluks. And when it came down, it killed a bunch of the Mamluk troops as well. So the Templars took a lot of the enemy with them at that last stand. So I do think that is a standout moment for me, for the Templars.
I agree. It's one of the most dramatic moments in Templar history. I will only say, in the defense of the Mamluks, that it's possible that when the Templars made the terms that anybody in the citadel should be allowed to withdraw, the Mamluks, being who they were, may not have considered women and children human beings, and therefore, for them, the terms only applied to the Templars. That it may have been it may have been complete miscommunication on the part of Templars, who were obviously consider themselves the protectors of women and children in the church, and the Mamluks, who don't consider women humans, they're animals.
Interesting. Yeah, I've never heard that point made, but that certainly seems like that could have played a role. And I think we have to acknowledge that. Yeah, interesting. But yeah, that is such a great moment, though. I mean, there's so much stuff from the Crusades that is better than anything that's in any movie. It's pretty intriguing. And then Chris wants. Go
history's
ahead.
Better than fiction. History's better than fiction almost any time.
Definitely. Chris wants to know: did the Franks perform the Latin Mass in Outremer or perform the Eastern Rite? Both.
No, the definition of it depends. The terms you're using. Frank replies to Latin Christian. The term Frank refers to those who follow the Latin Rite, whether they were Crusaders temporarily in the kingdom, militant monks temporarily in the kingdom, or the descendants of Crusaders who settled in the kingdom and followed the Latin rites. However, in the entire time period of the Crusader states, they formed a minority of the Christians in the Outremer, and the majority of Christians in Outremer followed various Orthodox rites. Just one Eastern Rite. There were a variety of Eastern rites that were being performed throughout the Crusader period in Outremer.
Yeah, within the Crusader states, both would have been performed, but yes, the Franks themselves, the Latin Christians, observed the Latin Rite. And but I know we were talking about this last time, Helena, that perhaps there was some blurring of those distinctions as families intermarried, and the two groups got closer and closer, which they did the longer.
My favorite story is the Pope during the Civil War in the Crusader states, when the Pope, I forget which one it was, whether it was Gregory IX or his successor, tried to punish the Ebelins and the Commune of Acre for supporting the Ebelins by excommunicating and introducing an interdict of Acre, so that they were prohibited from, going to mass, burials, weddings, baptisms, everything. And the population of Acre promptly churches. It had zero impact. They, in England, the interdict practically brought down King John. An interdict in Western Europe was a disaster. People rotting in the streets, and nobody could get married, and horrible impact. Holy Land, that's good. We'll go next door to the Orthodox Church. Fine, thanks. The Pope immediately backwatered. He was losing his flock.
All right, so guys, we're kind of coming toward the end here. I want to remind everybody, Helena's new book, The Holy Land in the Era of the Crusades, Kingdoms at the Crossroads of Civilizations, a really good book about the history of the Crusader states. So
it's available in ebook. It's available in ebook. You don't have to pay the full price.
Absolutely.
It's hardback right now, or ebook. It'll eventually go to paperback.
And there's the cover on the screen right now. Hope you guys will check it out. I know probably a fair number of people in the chat today have already read it, which I'm happy about that.
Please with good reviews.
Yeah, and do give it a review on Amazon to help get the word out. Let's see here. Let's do a few more questions here. It's always good to have Helena here to get some of her insights. So here's a good one from Joe. I know we've probably talked about this in so many streams now. Could Richard have taken Jerusalem if he decided to march on it and not order a retreat?
It depends when. First of all, there was 2 attempts. In the winter, it was probably impossible. The weather was terrible. His army had been badly, what do you say, weakened by snowstorms and everything, and wasn't adequately prepared for. The second attempt in the summer might have been successful, but the problem is that taking Jerusalem, they didn't have the force to hold Jerusalem. And both decisions were not because of an inability to take the city, but an inability to hold it and defend it.
Right. Yeah, he was taking the advice of the Templars and Hospitallers and local lords and knights who knew the area well, and this is
including
what they,
Balian, who had just defended the city.
Right.
Balian was in that army. He knew exactly what it was like trying to defend that city from the inside.
It kind of says something about Richard, I think. I mean, Richard was somebody who respected those who could give him good advice, and he seemed to be somebody who knew who to take advice from. I mean, unlike Frederick II, who basically ignored all advice and acted like a tyrant. But yeah, Richard the Lionheart, I mean, he was not some kind of hothead, arrogant fool who just did whatever he wanted. I mean, he took seriously the opinions of people like Balian of Ibelin and the Templars and individuals who he knew he could trust, who he knew they knew what they were talking about. And this is what they told him. They said, look, I think, if they had said to him, yeah, let's go for it, I think he may have done it. Well, but I think he really took their opinion about it seriously.
Significantly, Richard offered to fight as an ordinary soldier. If the council decided to assault, he would take part as a soldier. Mm-hmm. But he would not lead it because he refused to take responsibility for what he thought would be a disaster. And that says it all.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. So let's say like 2 more questions here. Got a bunch in here. Sorry, we can't get to them all today, guys. Let's see here. Are you looking at the screen? Do you see any that you like here?
I can't see the screen except what you put up.
Okay. Let's see.
You'll have to share a different screen.
This is interesting from Alexander. Was civil war more common in the Christian or Muslim world at the time of the Crusades? That's what I was
common in
trying
the
to
Muslim. More common.
Probably, yeah.
Muslim world. It's much more common in the Muslim world. Just take one little slice. When Almaric of Jerusalem dies unexpectedly at age 38, his leper son is recognized as his heir within days, and he's crowned, and the entire kingdom does homage to him. At roughly the same time, Nur ad-Din dies. You have the next 30 years of civil war in the Muslim states. Mm-hmm. Well, Saladin comes in, takes Jerusalem, but doesn't get Aleppo, and then has to take Mosul. There was the whole time, there was no clear succession from the Mamluks. I mean, I listed it. Let me, if I can pull it up very fast.
All the Mamluk sultans who were assassinated.
Yes, one after another. Yeah, one after another. Yeah. And the Ayyabuds were fighting with each other all the time. That's how the Crusaders ended from that little tiny strip of land that Richard managed to conquer to practically the same borders they'd had before Hattin, simply by paying the Ayyabuds off against one another and helping first one and then the other and then the other and the other. Yeah, there was almost constant fighting with the Baghdad. What am I trying to say? The Asavid Caliphate. Before they came, and they can.
Yeah, I know that in that really famous book, The Crusades Through Arab Eyes, Amin Maalouf, the epilogue to that book is the most interesting part, where he gives his opinion on the issues with the Muslim political institutions. And one of the things he says is he talks about how much more stable the political institutions were in the Frankish states than they were in the Muslim world. And, in some ways, I think it relates to just very different political traditions. I mean, you see the same thing in Spain. I mean, in the Western states in the Middle Ages, you seem to have these ideas, these abstract ideas of a state, which kind of can even survive the destruction of that state. Like the King of Jerusalem, that was a concept that people continued to believe in and act as if it was a real thing long after the state itself was gone. Whereas it seems like in the Muslim world, you'd have a powerful ruler emerge, and that was the basis of the power. And then when he would die, everything he built would kind of like fall apart. Or, I mean, it was just a very different way of conceptualizing these political entities. I mean, I think, the Ayyubid Sultanate, what was that exactly? I mean, it doesn't seem like it was nearly as concrete a concept as the Crown of Jerusalem. That's the impression I get.
Because it's based on a sultan. Of course, you could say that a kingdom should be based on a king, but it was very different. I felt like after I read about the Crusader states, I understood the modern Middle East better.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes.
And so this will be our last question, actually. This is a good one from John. Where can I buy a copy?
On Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, at your local bookstore. It's anywhere, actually. Anywhere you can buy books, you should be able to buy this.
Yeah.
This is published by Pen and Sword, a major British publisher.
It's definitely easy to pick up on Amazon. You guys can find it there. So pick up a copy, leave a review. And yeah, it's been great to have you on, Helena. It's always fun to get you on here. And we'll have to do this again in the not too distant future. I'm kind of trying to just have lots of people on this little casual thing I do. I mean, this is a fun thing. And just to let everybody know what this is, Coffee and the Crusades. I do it every Tuesday and Friday, 12 noon Eastern time, 11 a.m. Central time, for half an hour to an hour, and just a casual way to hang out and talk about medieval history. So yeah, I actually will not be back this coming Friday because I'm going to be pretty busy the rest of the week, and I've got stuff going on that's going to prevent me from streaming on Friday. But we will get back to the regular schedule on Tuesday. So next Tuesday on the 27th, we'll get back again, same time, 11 a.m. Central Time, 12 noon Eastern Time, U.S. time. That's a very different time for people in Greece, right, Helena?
That's true, but it's a good time for me too. Look forward to doing this again, and it was a pleasure having everybody here. Thanks for your questions.
All right. Thanks, guys. We'll catch you again soon. And until next time.